We begin in Ottawa, where for the first time in Canada, the RCMP has laid terrorism and hate propaganda charges against an individual advocating a violent far-right ideology. Patrick Gordon McDonald, a 26-year-old from Ottawa, is facing 3 charges: participating in a terrorist group, facilitating terrorist activity, and commission of offense for a terrorist group, in this case, the willful promotion of hatred. McDonald was unmasked by Vice News in 2021 as an alleged key architect of neo-Nazi propaganda for the Atomwaffen Division terrorist group. Vice reported they tracked McDonald down to his parents' home here in Ottawa. The Canadian government designated Atomwaffen a terrorist entity in 2021, saying the group calls for acts of violence against racial, religious, and ethnic groups and informants, police, and bureaucrats to prompt the collapse of society.
Mr. McDonald is believed to have played a role with the production, distribution of propaganda aimed at enhancing the capacity of this terrorist entity. It's important to reassure the population. At the time being, the investigation that we've led has not managed to confirm any imminent threat to public safety.
For more on this, I'm joined by Leah West and Jessica Davis. Leah is an associate professor of national security law at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Jessica is president at Insight Threat Intelligence. Gang, it's good to have you back. Jessa, let's start with you, with the charges in this case. Just how significant are these?
These are very serious charges. They're interesting because they don't seem to be tied to any active plot or ongoing threat. So they're really about participating in and facilitating terrorist activity. This is a bit different than some of the charges that we've seen in most other cases in Canada, which have been primarily tied to potential attacks or plots or even travel abroad. So it really shows a bit more of a broadening of the concept of what is terrorism in Canada, particularly with the group that this individual is tied to.
Right. So Leah, in terms of the charges and the weight they carry, I mean, how serious are they and what kind of punishment does the accused face if found guilty?
Very serious. 2 of the offenses, the specific delineated terrorism offenses, so participating in activity of a terrorist group and facilitating terrorist activity, both carry up to a maximum of 14 years in prison. And interestingly, the commission of offense for a terrorist group, in this case, the willful promotion of hatred, actually could carry a life sentence. And that's really interesting because the actual offense he's accused of, the willful promotion of hatred, in and of itself only garners a sentence of maximum of 2 years. The other thing to think about is terrorism offenses are supposed to be served consecutively, not concurrently. So when we add it all up, this individual is facing a potential very long period of incarceration.
Okay, so this is a young man we're talking about here, Jess. So what do we know about Patrick McDonald?
So far, what we know is primarily driven by Vice reporting. So a couple of years ago, Vice reporters tracked down the individual that they thought was named Dark Foreigner, and it turns out to be McDonald. And in this article that they wrote about him, it talks about all the propaganda that he's produced. So in 2018, he illustrated the cover of a very famous neo-Nazi propaganda book written by somebody who also is on Canada's terrorism list as well. So he's been really instrumental in creating propaganda, creating the aesthetic of Atomwaffen Division. And that's primarily information that we know from the Vice reporting. The RCMP has told us very little so far about this individual and what he's been involved in.
Okay, so Leah, what's the significance of the RCMP laying these charges? The first time an individual with alleged far-right radical beliefs charged with both terrorism and hate propaganda charges.
I think there's a lot of different things that I can unpack here, but the biggest thing here is that recognizing that the role propaganda plays in terrorist movements, especially in right-wing movements, deserves to be seen as criminal. It's not just people engaging in free speech online. And it's advancing terrorist causes, and in particular, in this instant, advancing the narrative and allowing a very dangerous terrorist organization to advance its narrative and to recruit and attract new potential viewers of its propaganda and potential members to its cause, and to say that in itself deserves not only the label of a hate crime, so promotion of hatred, but to recognize that as terrorist activity that they are participating in, and that actually facilitates the activities of Atomwaffen is hugely symbolic, and I think an important step, given how much we've seen the growth of online hate perpetrated by terrorist organizations to try and recruit into their organizations.
Right. So, Jess, let's talk a little bit about this organization. You've both referenced it, this neo-Nazi Atomwaffen division that McDonald is allegedly tied to. I mean, what do we know specifically about this group and really just kind of this acceleration in white supremacist activity more broadly?
There's a lot to unpack here. So Atomwaffen division has actually been disbanded. It hasn't really existed per se since about 2018, 2020. It's been replaced by National Socialist Order, which a lot of people think is just sort of the next iteration of the same group, or renaming with a few different members. There's another thing that I want to unpack here. We're all using the term organization, and I think that really overstates what we're talking about here. This is really a movement. And in fact, this group and others like it really pursue this idea of leaderless resistance in a lot of ways to try to prevent law enforcement and security services from being able to track them, to be able to identify networks. So really, Atomwaffen division, National Socialist Order is much more of a movement. And this movement is what I would describe primarily as white power accelerationism. White power, it's what it sounds like. It's a bunch of people espousing white supremacy, white nationalism, often at the violent expense of non-white people. The accelerationist piece is kind of interesting because a lot of these groups in Atomwaffen division and National Socialist Order believe that the current society is in a state of collapse, but that collapse needs to be accelerated, hence the accelerationist term, in order to bring about the conditions that can allow for a white ethno-state or a white utopia to exist. So it's really fundamentally about white power accelerationism. And these might seem like strange terms, but they're going to become household terms, just like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State did. This is the era of terrorism that we're in now.
So Leah, essentially it's groups that want to burn it all down so they can rebuild it in the image they prefer.
Yes, and I think that this notion, or as Jess explains, that it's a movement and not an organization is really important because that shows how important propaganda is to uniting disparate people who are not, under the banner of a single leader who can give them directions and orders. How important propaganda is to that movement, to bringing people into that movement and tying them together. And so I think, again, this shows why it's so important to target those who are engaged in this kind of activity for this and other movements. And so I'm really pleased to see the RCMP bring this charge today because it signifies that they understand how important propaganda is to movements like this, movements that pose a very serious risk to Canadian security and international security as well.
Okay, Leah, just stick with you and then Jess for a quick final thought. What are you watching for next in the case of Patrick McDonald?
I'm really interested to see the facts that they use to attach to each offense to see if they, and this is a really nerdy thing to be looking for, but whether or not they use the same facts for each three of the charges, because I think that will be, again, very interesting to see how propaganda, the creation of propaganda, can be used to prove or to establish, I should say, each different type of offense, because that would be very new from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, Jess, what about you?
I think Leah and I will be nerding out about most of the same things on this issue. For me, it's really about understanding if propaganda is the extent of the activity that he's involved in. Because as Leah's correctly saying, propaganda is really fundamental to these movements. It's also how they finance. So if there's any other individuals who are identified through the course of this investigation, who the other individual that was arrested at the same time, I think today, what charges they might face. So all of these things, if there's any sort of network component to this, as well as those facts that Leah's talking about.